The Airline Business Podcast is sponsored by Panasonic Avionics. Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, European consolidation heads north with Air France-KLM moving for SAS, and what next for the industry's efforts to decarbonise. My name's Graham Dunn, Executive Editor at Flight Global, and joining me as ever is Airline Business Editor Lewis Harper. Hi, Lewis.
Hi, Graham. How are you?
Yes, very good, very good. We've both been on the road a little bit over these past few weeks, and it's been a really interesting time for the airline industry, hasn't it?
It has, yes. Inevitably, when you're at a conference, really concentrating on a particular subject, another story will break, and you kind of wish you were there to cover that. But yeah, it's certainly interesting time in terms of consolidation. Obviously, it's a theme we've talked about a reasonable amount coming out of COVID, but I think we're starting to see it ramping up even more in Europe at the moment.
Yes, and it's very interesting. The recent development, of course, is that Air France-KLM has emerged as a potential investor in SAS. So that's part of the financial restructuring package and a consortium that has been put together to do that. And Air France-KLM has emerged as taking a 19.9% stake in SAS, which the deal is still to be to go through the restructuring process. SAS is in the middle of a Chapter 11 financial restructuring, so that element is still to come. But I think what's interesting, this kind of caught us a little bit by surprise, I think. It certainly caught me a bit by surprise, because you almost had two stories going on. You have the SAS and its financial restructuring, and you have European consolidation efforts. And I hadn't really put two and two together that the two might meet in this way.
No, I think we'd been very much looking south, I think, in Europe, understandably, given we got IATA with Lufthansa, we've got Air Europa with IAG, and then, of course, as we talked about recently, we've got TAP now, that process kicking off. So I think we were sort of looking in the wrong direction maybe, and like you say, perhaps because of the depth of SAS's troubles, it felt like maybe there was that wasn't necessarily on the table as immediate options. So despite the fact, I think Ben Smith, obviously Air France-KLM chief executive, have talked about the group looking at options, and he had named TAP in that sense as well. It wasn't one we necessarily saw coming, and it's an intriguing one, certainly with SAS. I mean, SAS, I think it's fair to say, has been a bit of a friendless airline maybe in the region compared with a lot of others. So it's not part of one of the big groups. It's not part of any of the big joint ventures like the One World One, for example, across the transatlantic. So, and it's got quite a long history of low margins and challenges with unions and its cost base and all this. So it did take us a bit by surprise. And I think it's fair to say, if Air France-KLM does eventually become, majority owner of that business, it's taking on a few challenges.
Yeah, definitely so. And I mean, one of the reasons it's interesting is partly because SAS has felt very embedded in Star Alliance. It was a founding member of Star Alliance. It, off and on, there's been, various dalliances and reported moves over potentially Lufthansa being an investor in that carrier. We haven't seen much of that over the past decade or so, but certainly in the 2000s, that seemed a sort of combination. It never really emerged, but obviously SAS was a significant part of Star Alliance. And so, that part of it, maybe one of the reasons it's a bit of a surprise. I mean, we have three airline groupings, and in fact, we have three big European airline groupings and three alliances, and they're obviously interconnected in some way. Obviously, Air France-KLM with Sky Team, Lufthansa with Star Alliance, and IAG with One World. And from a network carrier perspective, at least in terms of the Nordic regions, there's really only been SAS and Finnair, and SAS is involved with Star Alliance and Finnair with One World. So SkyTeam has never really had much of a presence in that sector. So it is quite interesting. one of the sort of the byproducts of consolidation, and we're seeing this across some other moves, is that you are getting some movements of camps in terms of that alliance sphere, and it will be quite interesting what Star Alliance then decides this means for it in the Nordic region.
It will, yeah. I think it's our fault for. I think we've written about 2 or 3 years ago about how the alliances are no longer about membership, and it's all about the technical and work going on behind the scenes and all this. And I think since then, we, as you say, it's there have been a few significant moves there. But yeah, no, it's certainly right, and you can sort of see from SkyTeam's point of view there, with IAG and Lufthansa making these moves, you sort of see the Air France and KLM businesses sort of being sandwiched between these two sort of expanding groups, and you can sort of see the logic in Air France, wanting to make these moves. I think there's kind of a consensus that Ben Smith has done a good job with Air France-KLM, certainly since the end of the pandemic. The margins are improving, they're coming out of it fairly confidently. So it's, I guess, in some ways not a surprise they want to be making these kind of quite proactive moves there. But yeah, the way it shakes out alliance-wise will be intriguing, and certainly with the IATA deal as well, there's all sorts of moving parts around alliances in Europe in a way, I guess, that we perhaps didn't think was coming, as I say, 2 or 3 years ago. But yeah, SAS as a business, as I mentioned before, certainly won't be without its challenges, and I think Ben Smith thought that getting Air France-KLM back on track was tough. I think if they're eventually in a position to do that SAS, that's certainly going to be a challenge. And I think obviously part of SAS's challenges historically have been around the ownership structure, meaning they're tied to having two relatively close hubs in Stockholm and Copenhagen, which obviously isn't necessarily ideal. So a shift towards, if eventually we've got majority ownership of an airline group, maybe a shift towards maybe one or other of those hubs would be a logical move. And obviously Air France-KLM will know better than most anyway about dealing with the politics of government ownership as well. So that is an interesting one. I think the potential for Transavia as well in that region will be an interesting thing to watch if this does eventually get approved. We know that Norwegian have been quietly expanding in that region, the low cost sphere. I don't think they have masses of competition there. The kind of pan-European low-cost carriers, I think, struggled a bit with costs in that market with airport fees and things like that. So they haven't necessarily made huge strides into that market. So that, it wouldn't be a surprise if Air France-KLM see Transavia as an option into that market as well.
One little small side point, I think, around kind of the opportunities in Scandinavia for Air France-KLM. I think it's quite interesting. You've seen it with IAG, and I think one of the things you do see with these pan-European groups is this kind of trading off the hubs of the member airlines. Mm-hmm. Now with Air France-KLM, it's at the moment, is it the Paris hub or is it the Amsterdam hub? And we all know what's going on at Amsterdam in terms of the potential cutting back of capacity there. There's a whole legal process around that in terms of the Dutch government. Admittedly, the Dutch government, which is collapsed. So we wait what happens to that policy, and there's a legal challenge around it. But introducing a cap on the flight departures out of Schiphol Airport going forward, based around countering noise levels. Now, obviously, having more bases within the group, provides more options to add capacity and direct capacity, but it also gives the group, maybe strengthens their hand a little bit in terms of those political negotiations, being able to say to the Dutch government, well, actually, do you know what? We might move more capacity out to Copenhagen or Stockholm or who knows, Lisbon.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and that certainly is. I mean, I would say that to do that, they've probably chosen another market where, if you were to guess where there might be the next move by a government to cap capacity on sustainability grounds, you probably would be looking towards those sort of SAS markets, certainly. And I know that obviously the kind of flight shaming movement has its sort of origins in that region, but yeah, it does make a lot of sense if KLM is staring at a future where it's structurally having to be forced to be a smaller operator from that big hub, then certainly you're right. it strengthens Air France-KLM's hand as a business in more than one way, certainly, yeah, in terms of just simply having outlets for its capacity, but also, politically, as you say, the Dutch government and whatever the Dutch government becomes has made these moves. I guess there is a tipping point where I don't think many governments would deny the advantages that aviation brings, so economically, socially, that kind of thing. And the airlines do still have a bit of power in that regard, particularly if they can simply move capacity elsewhere. And we know that certainly Michael O'Leary is particularly in the low cost sphere is particularly well versed at that kind of manoeuvring when it suits Ryanair. As
you say, there's also the whole regulatory picture and sphere of getting these over the line. Now, in the Air France-KLM SAS move, I mean, there's a process which is, around the financial restructuring, but because it's only 19.9%, that side of it becomes much easier. There are provisions under which, over time, after a couple of years or so, where there would be a potential route path for Air France-KLM to take a controlling interest, but it's at this stage it is just a minority holding, and we've seen that with IAG and Air Europa. Now, that's an intriguing one because it's a deal that was in play before the pandemic, and IAG has had a couple of goes at trying to get this to work, and the pandemic obviously created one problem, and there's elements in structuring that deal which make it more challenging, but then there's also the regulatory picture, and you come back to what kind of sacrifices does an airline think it is worth making in order to consolidate. And with ITA, Lufthansa making its bid there, again, initially a minority, but with an option to move to a majority. It was interesting. I mean, Carsten Spohr is sort of, when you look at the low cost picture and the strength of Ryanair in Europe, there's no grounds for regulatory approval not to come on that. But we did see, some reports emerging that the Italian government was a bit frustrated at the pace and maybe the direction of the European Commission process looking into that deal as well. So, I think this is one of the bigger challenges around there is actually completing any of this consolidation in Europe, even within the European Union, which is at least a single common aviation area. But, trying to complete those mergers is not straightforward.
No, and I think there's a kind of a global thing there as well. I suppose when we look to the US with JetBlue and the Northeastern Alliance, and obviously not good noises coming out about the Spirit deal as well at the moment. So there is, I think, there's a broader theme, certainly Europe and North America around, and also obviously Latin America. We've got the Abra group being developed there with Go and Avianca at the centre of it. These things have never been easy, but certainly the noises that are coming out of government in a lot of these cases aren't particularly encouraging towards them happening. And that is a theme to keep an eye on. It's difficult to know where that comes from, whether there's a general mood globally away a bit from sort of globalization. Maybe individual governments are a bit more conscious of the value of some of these strategic assets being held locally, for example. I mean, that obviously isn't the case in the domestic US market, but certainly, it's a theme to keep an eye on. I don't think anyone is going to be making assumptions about these things getting over the line, as you say, particularly if they come with quite big sacrifices in terms of slots at key airports, because clearly a lot of the value in that consolidation will come from having those slots and those network options as a group. But yeah, it's certainly what's playing out in Europe and the impact it's having on alliances, and as you say, and is going to be something to watch. And it's quite interesting that there's been a bit of surprise here. It feels like a lot of the low hanging fruit's gone, so we know TAP now is in a process, and we don't know who will end up with that. But it's certainly this a phase we're going through now of truly becoming a bit more US like in Europe, I think, where there aren't really going to be any significant maybe legacy network carriers left, maybe apart from Finnair, for example. But there aren't going to be many left who aren't part of one of the big groups, and that is certainly a thing some people have been predicting for a while. It'll be interesting to watch whether that spills over into the low cost sector, of course, where we have it's fair to say probably 3 decent sized pan-European low cost carriers, and I think a lot of people will talk about there being maybe space for two. And even if that consolidation might involve, a movement of one of those into one of the airline groups. But maybe I'm getting carried away by this this minority stake that Air France-KLM is looking to take.
So TAP Air Portugal, a lot of eyes now turn to that as the airline privatisation in play. Portugal has now passed a decree to make that happen, although we don't know the full details on that process now. And I think it becomes interesting, I think, to some extent, for an airline, it's integrating an airline into a group, whether that is full merge or even just as a strategic partner in some way, it is a lot of work. It is quite complicated, and I think there was an elegance to that period where IAG was working on bringing Air Europa in, and Lufthansa was working on bringing ITA in. Both of those two carriers are SkyTeam carriers, ITA and Air Europa. So they would move alliances, which then seemed to make things very neat that Air France-KLM didn't have anything else going on. So it would be in pole position for TAP. But obviously Air France-KLM does have some other bits going on. But, I think it is interesting. All three carriers have said they remain interested and have expressed interest. I think you'd expect that it would be a weird head of a European airline group who immediately dismissed someone before they've even had the conversations with it. So, there's still some time to be seen exactly what happens. It does feel as though Air France-KLM and SkyTeam could do with that Southern European partner. I mean, they have Tarom in the group, Air France. It just changes the dimension a bit, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And as you say, there is perhaps just standing back at it, TAP does seem logical for Air France-KLM. I think it wouldn't, when you talk about the regulatory challenges, it wouldn't be difficult to suggest that the path for IAG might be quite challenging, given that they're already making deeper moves into Spain with Air Europa. You talk about the Iberian Peninsula, you'd think that then going for Portugal's flag carrier might throw up some particular challenges for them. Not saying it'd be impossible, but as you say, particularly with when you look at the alliance mix and everything, and of course, maybe everything does come back to alliances, because the Air Europa deal may be partly driven by LATAM's shift away from One World towards SkyTeam itself, and in doing that, of course, IAG lost. They still obviously partner in some ways, but they lost the alliance partner there, the biggest player in Latin America that had significant services into Europe. So, and then connections onwards, I guess, in the Latin America region. So, there's a lot at play here, and TAP it'll be fascinating to watch that play out. And we say all this, of course, and it will be some fourth party we haven't thought of that buys them. But,
yes, well, it was David Neeleman's Atlantic Gateway who bought them previously. It'll be interesting. I mean, I suppose competition, it does depend how you view it, don't you? I mean, the LATAM are in the Air France-KLM, SkyTeam, Delta camp now, so maybe that could be a complicating factor from the other side. I do think that one will definitely be interesting to watch how that develops. As you say, you have other carriers who will be looking for partners. An interesting one that just developed over the last few days was Air Malta, a small standalone network carrier. Air Malta's always struggled historically to make money. It's had a lot of pressure from low cost carriers coming into the country, but as an island, a national carrier is, or a carrier within its own destiny, I suppose, is something that and the Maltese government feels strongly around. So now there is a plan which has just been unveiled. So the Maltese government has just unveiled a plan to create a successor carrier to Air Malta, and that kind of follows a similar line to ITA's creation in Italy almost a couple of years ago, where they basically run out of road for finding ways to prop up and recover the existing flag carrier. And so successor carrier is established. In Malta, the interesting thing to some extent is that they're looking at, and they're talking about an 8 aircraft operation, which is similar to what they have already. And this is quite a central part for that project. They feel they've managed to get across to the European Commission, and the Commission hasn't really commented, but this process has been drawn up certainly in discussion with the European Commission, and they obviously feel that they've been able to demonstrate that 8 is a kind of optimal size for the airline, whereas what we have seen with some of the other successor carriers is that part of the quid pro quo seems to be that it'd be a slightly smaller operation. But I think if I was to guess what the European Commission's view would be on it, or the argument from that side, is it's very much around what makes an airline a sustainable size. And I think maybe you could argue that 8 aircraft isn't going to be game changing in that market. So it is probably more about trying to create a carrier that can be sustainable and doesn't need the financial bailing out in a few years' time. So that's probably what's driven that. With Air Malta, there's a desire to find a strategic partner as well. And it'll be interesting who some of these strategic partners will be. And I don't think they will necessarily all come from within those big 3 airline groups.
No, that's it, and it's one to keep in mind. I think obviously the Maltese market is sometimes quite distorted when you're looking at the data for it, because obviously a number of airlines base aircraft there, not least Ryanair with its Malta Air operation, which I curse the day they named it that, because the confusion that causes is a bit frustrating. But so there are good reasons why airlines will base aircraft in as part of obviously the Europe's liberalised market. So you can base aircraft there and operate them from other places. But it's an intriguing market for that reason. But certainly, as you say, it's not in terms of the core kind of national carrier type operations. I think it's a relatively small operation, and for that reason, possibly, like you say, it's probably more likely to investors beyond the big 3 might look at it. So another one to keep an eye on and to get by the regulators, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So as mentioned at the top of the podcast, we have both been out and about over the past couple of weeks, and we'll talk a bit more about some of the messaging and thoughts that we picked up from those conferences after the break.
Hello listeners, I'm Andy Mason, and I want to introduce you to Beyond Entertainment, a new podcast from Panasonic Avionics. Each week we sit down with the best and brightest in our industry for a quick chat on the future of passenger experience. Everything from display and audio technology to in-flight Wi-Fi and killer digital content to meaningful market research. We're looking at what's now, what's new, and what's next. So join us as we explore the passenger experience. Go Beyond Entertainment. Available now on your favourite podcasting platforms or on our website, panasonic.aero/Beyond Entertainment.
So welcome back. And as you mentioned, both myself and Lewis have been out on the road a little bit. Lewis, you were in Madrid recently.
Yeah, it's the IATA World Sustainability Symposium. It's the first running of that event. I guess it does reflect the importance of that issue, that I think this will become a sort of key part of IATA's conference slate. And I think it was pretty well attended as well, and some speakers from around the world, from a few airline CEOs from different regions. So it was interesting event. I think what we know, the tough thing for anything like this is that the airline industry sort of knows what the problem is, sort of knows what sort of needs to happen to get there, but the concrete progress is the bit that everyone is absolutely crying out for. But we're kind of moving towards that phase. I think there obviously are things happening, but equally there are still debates happening around, and there will be, I guess, but certainly in the short to medium term, I think about how the industry is going to get there, because we are, what comes across in events like this is that there's pretty broad agreement that sustainable aviation fuel is the big issue, is the one that is within reach. And I think the key point about SAF is that it can power existing fleets, because 2050 is only 27 years away, and You look at the investments airlines are making in fleets to get the latest generation technology. You look at the order books at the big airframers, and I think even if there is, a remarkable breakthrough technology, as Airbus is still talking about mid 2030s for hydrogen power, for example, it's probably not going to touch the sides of the fleet that could build up by 2050. So, SAF is really the big talking point, and within that there are multiple issues really, and lots of these were discussed at the event. From everything from where is that SAF coming from, so it's very biomass focused at the moment. But a lot of people talk up the potential power to liquid, so essentially using carbon dioxide that's been pulled from the air, and of course that brings up as well a carbon capture, which is part of that process, and the role that might play, in simply pulling, airlines, essentially paying for carbon dioxide to be pulled from the air. But in terms of SAF, the other talking points are the big regional disparities. So this came up at the IATA AGM, certainly in the context of Africa being a region where there's basically no progress at all on building a SAF industry. There's sort of similar noises from Latin America, really. The CEO of LATAM Airlines Group, Roberto Alvo, spoken. While LATAM Airlines has sort of set its own SAF mandate by 2030, there's basically very little movement in the region towards creating an industry, whereas everyone looks to the US now, and particularly California, where there's a lot of talk of carrot and stick approaches when it comes to SAF, and there's certainly a perception that the US has gone hard on carrot, whereas in Europe, and Anne Regel was there, the CEO of Air France, talking about the SAF mandates in Europe being a big thing, but at the same time that there's a lot more questions about where that fuel's actually going to come from, and who's going to pay for it, and then at the same time there was a representative from the Asia region there, and the chairman of Cathay Pacific, Patrick Healy, and he was talking about how China is going to be, and China is, I guess, gearing up to announce its own SAF policy and regulations, and his view was that he reckons they'll get the mix right between carrot and stick, so incentives versus mandates. So and many more talking points around SAF, which do reflect the fact that the industry is still at an early stage. But there was also a lot of talk about this isn't just about 2050. To get to 2050, you need targets along the way, and to meet even the 2030 targets, when it takes 3, 4, 5 years, whatever, to get a SAF plant up and running, that if things aren't happening now, there's certainly questions around whether those targets could be met. One interesting point of view that a few expressed was that while there may be slowness in the near term getting the SAF industry ramping up, there was a degree of confidence that what might happen is that in the early 2030s, for example, we may see a sudden flurry where there's almost a critical mass where things really ramp up quickly. It may be wishful thinking in some ways, but I think there may be historical parallels in that sense, that it's tough getting this kind of industry going, but when it does get going, we may see the energy companies really start to appreciate that this is the future, and that there's definite commitment to taking the SAF, that we might see a big ramp up that happens quite quickly. Within that, as we know, there are lots of challenges. So we know that airlines are happy to say, now we'll take all the SAF that's made, even though it's 4 times, 5 times the cost of jet fuel. But if that was 10% of their fuel bill, would they still be as happy to be taking SAF at that cost? So I think, and we talked about this recently, didn't we, Graham, that kind of, there's a slight contradiction going on between airlines kind of do and don't want mandates, and do and think incentives are really important, but at the same time, there are arguments on both sides about why mandates work and why they don't. And unsurprisingly, in a global industry like this one, the kind of narrative isn't always that clear.
Yes, I mean, you kind of need mandates to get things over the line and to get the industry over the line, or the wider industry over the line. Obviously, where airlines are also wary of having a mandate whereby they're the ones who have to achieve it and hit it, and if it's not in their control, they're the ones who take the punishment as well.
That's right. And just one other area that kind of stood out to me is this idea of residual emissions. So even, under the best case scenario, there's a widespread recognition that there's going to be a certain level of emission that is unavoidable in the industry and for airlines. And there's the difficult conversations happening. There are still people that believe that offsetting needs to be will be a part of the answer to this. And, there were airline leaders quite, talking up some offsetting projects that really, they feel are genuine and really do offset that carbon. So that is one to watch, because we know there's really strong views from like Scott Kirby at United, for example, who doesn't particularly believe in offsetting. But, whatever the industry does, and this, I guess, is inherent in the concept of net zero, there are still going to be emissions that need to be dealt with in some way. Clearly, carbon capture could be part of that, and carbon credits and these kind of things are all part of it. And Anne Rigel talked about offsetting not really being something that works in her market with Air France, because the public opinion on offsetting is basically that it is just papering over the cracks, really. So they're more focused on allowing people to pay for SAF, for example, rather than offering options on offsetting. So it's a really fascinating area that, whichever way you look on this journey, it's a complicated one.
Definitely so. You also got a chance for a bit of an update on the economic picture as well.
Yeah, so I talked to Marie Owens Thompson, who on the one hand leads the sustainability brief at IATA, is also still the chief economist there, and it was just a good chance to catch up really on what IATA's take is on the current outlook globally. Of course, their analysis is very much looking at industry and regional level. So rather than, we've talked about in I think in previous podcast as well about, there are, the individual airline levels, there's a decent amount of commentary suggesting that, things not looking terrible, but certainly that things have changed a bit in terms of, this buoyant period coming out of COVID is maybe fading slightly. But certainly talking to Marie Owens Thompson, the overriding message is that, if anything, things look a bit brighter than they did in mid-year, when she had already talked about the industry being in a sweet spot, as it were. I think underpinning that really are, the continued strong recovery of traffic. There are issues with China's recovery, I think, not being quite as strong as anyone expected. But on the other hand, at the start of the year, many people didn't expect China to reopen at all for some time. So, more markets are open now. But at the same time, we know well that there are capacity constraints, which, while frustrating in some ways for airlines, does mean that, in an industry that is historically known for maybe having overcapacity issues, it's currently operating in a way where capacity is very tight. So load factors are pretty decent. I think the last time IATA talked about these, they were basically back up at 2019 levels or beyond. So, that's helping yields. And, even with, costs rising, so fuel costs coming up, it's still a pretty attractive operating environment for many. And at the same time, she was very firm on the lack of unemployment that's accompanying the kind of general economic challenges around the world as being unusual, but a factor that really does support the continued strong demand for air travel, combined with the kind of strong traffic recovery and the capacity constraints. So essentially, all the narrative around pent-up demand, she framed it in a slightly different way, saying all pent-up demand is it means that people want to travel. And if unemployment is pretty low, then enough people have the money to travel, and, will continue to do so. So, I suppose at some point we need to stop talking about pent-up demand. And it may be that, as things are at the moment, that this is, particularly because capacity is still got a little way to go to get to pre-COVID levels, this kind of sweet spot will continue. Obviously, she was very clear that the downside risks outweigh, I think, the upside risks. So we know, looking around the world, we know that the economic challenges in China reverberate around the world, and there are concerns about China's economy. We can already see that impact to an extent in cargo markets, which have been falling back sort of to pre-COVID levels after such a strong period during COVID. And we came close to a US government shutdown, which could have unimaginable consequences in many areas. So downside risks are there. We know the geopolitical situation in many areas. But they're also a scenario where the world economy keeps ticking along at around 3% GDP growth, and actually the demand holds up, and airlines are doing relatively well despite the cost challenges. So a positive picture. And I think you also were at a different event, weren't you, last week? Is it last week? I'm losing track of time at the moment. But yeah, you heard some quite positive takes, I think, on the outlook there, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I was at the World Aviation Festival in Lisbon, and artist Willie Walsh was speaking there, and similarly had that strong feeling that the demand remained strong, that generally they remained in a bright position, and that was echoed even more emphatically by Emirates President Tim Clark. They were both talking a lot about fuel. That's one of the other elements, and fuel was big talking points, and obviously that has gone up. Price of oil has gone up, and that is a factor. Now both Willie Walsh and Tim Clark talked about having an oil price of over $100 a barrel is something that the industry has shown it can remain profitable. Now obviously able to do that during a period of strong demand. There is a question as to what happens if that demand tails off and weakens, but equally, Tim Clark in particular felt that the oil price will settle back down. So whilst being confident of an ability to withstand high oil prices, there was also a belief that because of the position, the fragile nature of the economic recovery, it would be in people's interests, or the wider interests, for that price to settle back down at some point. One of the challenges that does emerge is the particular price of jet fuel, and we've talked a bit about this before. What's called in the industry called the crack spread, where the difference between the price of oil and the price of jet fuel, and that's at historically high levels, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and it's something IATA have been talking about for probably a year or more now. It's and it I think it partly comes from coming out of COVID, that while obviously the trend, jet fuel essentially tracks crude oil prices in the sense of the trend, it's that spread, which means it's more expensive than oil than it historically might have been, is a frustration for the airline industry. I think reading around it, I think some jet fuel producers have had some challenges ramping up coming out of COVID. Obviously the strength of the demand to jet fuel is perhaps been stronger than expected, given the strength of the traffic recovery this year. And as with so many different industries, outside airlines and aerospace sector, turning the economy off and back on comes with challenges. And I think it partly results from that. So yeah, that side of things is a frustration, I think, for the industry. I think when we're talking about costs as well, it's worth also looking across the global industry. Really, there are plenty of markets where, with inflationary pressures and everything, and a lack of workers, so whether that be pilots or elsewhere, we've seen some quite eye-watering, deals with unions. Certainly, if you look in the US, for example, where that have involved massive pay rises for pilots and crew, and and that does mean that structurally, a lot of airlines are now operating with a much higher cost base, a unit cost base, and I think that is clearly okay when we're in such a buoyant demand period. But I think if you're not in a market where you're at the same time able to aggressively grow and bring those unit costs down, I think it's certainly something that could become a theme looking into next year. It certainly does inarguably make certain airlines more vulnerable to a moderation in those yields and fares coming down, and in an environment where, regardless of what happens to fuel, almost they are structurally lumbered with much higher costs. And as I say, that isn't just the US market. There are plenty of markets where that's happening. Of course, we know that with inflation, that airlines would argue they can fares are supporting that, and that fair enough. But we know, as we go back to the fact this is a low margin industry, and those challenges are certainly something to keep an eye on, I think.
So plenty to keep our eye on going forward as ever. Lewis, that's all we have time for this time. Thanks for your time again. So our thanks to Panasonic Avionics for sponsoring the podcast. Do give the Beyond the Entertainment podcast a listen. Reminder, you can catch up on all the news and stories we mentioned in this podcast and much more at flightglobal.com. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, please like and review us. Don't forget to subscribe to get new episodes in your podcast feeds, and we'll see you again next time.